and welcome to our special episode of Ship or Snip on very young girls. This month is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and we're not going to be talking about a romantic relationship, but we'll be talking about a relationship between a trafficker and a survivor.
This month's documentary is called Very Young Girls. This documentary depicts the lives of several young girls, but for the sake of our episode, we're only going to be talking about three. We'll be talking about Carolina, Shaniqua, and Ebony. We'll be talking about how these girls are transitioning from what they call the life back to safety. But first, what we're going to talk about today is what is human trafficking. Today with us, we have our Anti Trafficking Project Coordinator, Diana, and our Anti Trafficking Advocate, Caryn. Diana, can you briefly explain what human trafficking is for us, please?
Yes, of course. When we're talking about human trafficking, we're talking about an individual taking advantage of somebody else for the purpose of labor servitude or commercial sexual exploitation, right? So when a trafficker induces an individual through force, fraud, and coercion to engage in labor servitude or commercial sexual exploitation. Something that I do want to highlight is that when it comes to minors, legally minors do not have to prove that there was any type of force, fraud, and coercion, and that's a lot to do with consent, right? So, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about consent in a few.
Well, seeing that we can't talk about human trafficking without talking about consent, as educators, we use certain acronyms to talk about consent with our community and our students. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about those acronyms that we use?
Sure. Yep. Here, the educators at Fearless, we like to use the acronym of fries and orange soda. So we have F is for freely given. So we know that when we give consent, it has to be something that we give freely, and we're not coerced to give consent, right? We have R, which stands for reversible. So once you give consent, you can take that back. So if you change your mind, that means that you can change your mind. If you say yes and you decide that you don't want to consent to that, you have that liberty to do that. We have I, that is informed. So we need to know what we're consenting to. We have E for enthusiastic. So we know that when we give consent, we're giving it happily, right? We're giving it because we want to give it freely, and it's by choice. We have S, which is specific, and that is when we need to know exactly what we're consenting to. We have O for ongoing. So that means that consent is something that we have to continually give. It's not something that we say yes, and that means that everything is okay. And S, we have sober, which means that we have to have a clear mind when we're giving consent.
Thank you, Andrea, for that explanation of our acronym, fries and orange soda. But for the sake of this documentary, we're going to switch over and talk to Caryn about what consent means to minors.
Yes, absolutely. So the age of consent in New York State is actually 17, which a lot of people always think it's 18 or older. So for New York, we also have a safe harbor law for human trafficking, which states that any minor under the age of 18 cannot be prosecuted for prostitution. So when this happens, we do not have to prove that there was force, fraud, or coercion involved in their case at all. We do this because they are under the age of 17 and they cannot consent or give permission to any of the acts that are happening.
Thank you, Caryn, for that explanation. But one question I would like to pose is, what are some of the vulnerabilities and misconceptions that these victims face that lead them to being trafficked? Diana?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good question because something that I do want to mention is that a lot of times when it comes to human trafficking, we think that a trafficker it's somebody who is a stranger, somebody who doesn't know the individual, right? Being an adult or being a youth. However, time and time again, we have seen that a trafficker it's a person that has already gained an individual's trust to be able to pay attention to their vulnerabilities and their needs, right? What is making them vulnerable? What do they need in their life at that moment, right? If there's a young individual, let's say, who does not have a strong support system at home, who might be suffering from abuse and neglect, who might not feel loved and cared for, right? And I'll give you an example so it's a little bit easier to understand. Let's say that there's a youth who is 14, 15 years old. There's all these issues going on at home. The youth decides to run away from home, right? And there might come an individual who might tell them, well, you know what? It's okay. You're able to stay here. I'll provide you food. I'll provide you care. You don't have to worry about anything, right? And everything seems to be fine for the first few weeks or the first few months. And then something changes, right? That individual might say, well, I have been caring for you. I have been loving you. I have been providing you with a place to sleep at nighttime. It's your turn to do something for me. Can you have sex with my friend? I don't have money to pay for rent this month. If you have sex with my friend is going to give you money, and then I'm going to be able to pay for rent, right? And because that 14, 15-year-old individual might be afraid to lose the only person that they believe it's caring for them and it's loving them, they might end up doing it. And then the trafficker might turn and say, well, moving forward, this is how you're going to pay for your portion of the rent. This is how you're going to pay for your portion of the bills, right? Again, when it comes to human trafficking, a trafficker is going to pay attention to what that individual's needs and vulnerabilities are. What are they missing that they could provide that to them and then exploit that?
What are some of the misconceptions that people have about these victims being trafficked? Do they believe that it can't happen to them, or it just doesn't happen in that area? Can you explain a little bit?
So one of the biggest misconceptions of human trafficking is that it's not happening here. That these youth are being kidnapped and taken to another country, or from another country brought here. What the realization is that it's happening right here in Orange and Sullivan County. It's happening right in our backyards. Another big misconception is the fact that people are thinking also that these youth are being kidnapped. There's majority of these youth are going home at night and sleeping in their beds. They're just missing for a period of time. So a lot of these misconceptions are a lot of things that have been, showed through the media and through different things. And, what we've learned is that it's happening right here all the time.
And something else that I do want to mention, just to follow up a little bit on what Caryn said, it's that when it comes to the vulnerabilities, right? A lot of times we think that something is not going to happen to us, right? That we're protected from everything and it cannot happen to us. But however, something that we have seen is that we all have vulnerabilities. We all have things that we need and want, things that make us vulnerable, right? And a lot of times, again, we might think that something is not going to happen to us, but when it comes to human trafficking, when it comes to traffickers, they do a really good job at identifying a person's vulnerabilities to be able to see what that individual person needs, right? So that's something that I really want to highlight, that it's important that we all become aware of our own vulnerabilities so we could safety plan around that.
And just to go with Diana, one of those misconceptions also is that it's always a man trafficker, and that's not true at all. It could be a man or a woman or however somebody self-identifies.
Thank you so much, Caryn, for that note. That was really important. And also Diana for what you mentioned. We're going to be talking about some of the behaviors that the traffickers use on the survivors. And although we have categorized it in 3 different sections of coercion, force, and fraud, we do want to note that that does not mean that a trafficker does not use a combination of these behaviors with a survivor, right? The first behavior that we want to talk about is coercion, and we see this in the film with Carolina. So she's already left her trafficker and she's part of GEMS, and she wants to better herself. She wants to go back to school. She knows that, and she states that it's important for her to get to further her education, right? But she is aware that she needs the documentation and identifications for her to be able to do and meet with her goals, right? However, she doesn't have her IDs or her green card. So in the documentary, we see that Carolina calls her trafficker so that she's able to get her green card, right? And although we don't know exactly what's going on in that call, we know that the trafficker is saying something in order to manipulate her and coerce her to come back to him, right? Even though she says, she asks, like, do you have my identifications? And we don't know what the trafficker is saying, but we know that by her response, we know that the trafficker is trying to get her to come back to him and pick up her identification. So she says, no, I'm not going to go to pick up my identifications. If I go, it's going to be with the captain of the precinct, right? But as the call continues, we don't know what necessarily the trafficker is saying or convincing or manipulating the survivor, Carolina, but we know that the tone changes, right? And she's being manipulated into believing, into like having all those emotions come back and how she used to feel about him, right? But at the end of the call, she says, I still love him. I say that I don't love him, but I still love him, right? And she actually ends up calling him back and telling him that she loves him.
I'm going to be talking about force. Force is another behavior that the traffickers used on these victims, making the girls have sex for money through threats and violence, isolating the girls from their friends and family by making it seem like they're the only ones that love them. They can't go to anyone else but them for all of their needs. One example that we see from the film is from Shaniqua. Shaniqua was 12 years old when she met her trafficker. She was coerced into going with her trafficker, and she attempted to run away once, but her trafficker met her at her friend's house. Her trafficker forced her in a car and proceeded to rape her. Shaniqua stated that it was her fault since she shouldn't have ran away when all she really wanted was her own childhood. That's the main reason why she ran away. She wanted to get out. She wanted to be a kid again. But the trafficker used his force to make her realize that she couldn't go anywhere or do anything without him. Through threats and intimidation, he was able to keep Shaniqua under his thumb for a lot longer.
Thank you so much, Nafi, for that example. The last behavior that we want to talk about is fraud. And this is when the trafficker uses like false lies and gives false hope to the survivors for them to think that they're working for the benefit of them both, when we know that the only one that's benefiting from that relationship is the trafficker, right? So for this example, we want to use Ebony. Ebony had already escaped her trafficker, and she was in New York, and she was part of the GEMS program, right? And she wanted to also better herself and be able to leave the life. However, she receives a call from her trafficker and convinces her with false hope and false promises for her to come back to Miami, right? And in the film, we see that Ebony is explaining and she's stating, she's like, I don't even know why I'm back here. I don't know why I came back. And then she also states that her trafficker, when he called her when she was in New York, stated that things would be different this time, that, you know, the things would not be the same as they were before. And we see again that behavior, right, of the trafficker giving that false promises and that false hope, and that's what made Ebony want to come back, right? Because she's thinking like things are going to be different now. However, she also states that she can't keep up with this, right? And we know that she's referring to like those high standards that are being put by the trafficker, right? So today it's this standard, but tomorrow it's probably something more, right?
Something that I do want to highlight based on also on what you're saying, Andrea, it's definitely that when we're talking about a trafficker identifying a person's vulnerabilities, right? Many times we see that something that falls into fraud, it's the traffickers like to play different roles, right? They might try to play the role of a parental figure, the role of a lover, the role of a friend, right? Again, to identify their needs, gain their trust, and then use that against them for exploitation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. But now that we now understand what human trafficking is, and we've actually gone through the documentary and seen some experiences that these victims have gone through, what can we do to help a friend that may be trafficked? Diana or Caryn, can either one of you answer that for me?
That's definitely a really good question. And that's something that we definitely always want to strive to be able to provide as much information to the community as possible, right? So let's say that there was an individual, either you or a friend, who might be experiencing human trafficking, right? It's really important to be aware and be connected to resources in the community, right? But also something else that it's really important is to be patient, right? To listen and listen to what the individual wants and needs. Because even though we will want an individual to be able to get out of the life immediately, at that moment, that might not be the safest thing for that individual to do, for that survivor to do, right? So it's really important to be patient, to listen to what they want and need, and to connect that individual to other resources that might be able to provide support, right? But also knowing that you might not exactly know what to do. And maybe the individual might not be aware as to what resources to reach out. So reach out to our hotline, right? Reach out to our hotline or reach out to the National Human Trafficking Hotline to be able to receive more information as to what to do and how can you support your friend. Caryn, anything else that you think?
I think the biggest thing, like Diana was saying, was to also empower them. You know, we here at Fearless have a 24-hour hotline that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's always an advocate on the other side of the line. Also, Monday through Friday from 8 to 8, we have our web chat so people can remain anonymous. You know, and we're here. We can be the biggest advocates for those victims and survivors to help them get out of the life.
Thank you so much for joining us today, ladies. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for this episode of Shipper Snip. Understanding that human trafficking is very important and it can happen anywhere. At the end of our video will be our contact information where you can contact any one of our trained advocates here at Fearless if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you all and have a great evening.